I am once again reading Brené Brown's book, Dare to Lead. And in it, Brené Brown is talking about, amongst other things, the willingness to be vulnerable. Now, she's talking about human relationship vulnerability, how we, our self-image or ego, responds to being vulnerable, and how we try to protect ourselves by not being vulnerable, often being untrue to our real selves, to enable us to fit in, to not rock the boat, so to speak. We all do it. Now, if you are a public speaker just starting off, you feel very vulnerable. Why? Because you are worried what other people are going to think about you. You might envisage worst case scenarios where people jeer and laugh and even throw things at you. It doesn't happen too often. Most people are hoping that you will succeed as a speaker. They're barracking for you, but you don't feel that way. But once you get over that initial nervousness as a speaker, you still remain quite vulnerable in the relationship stage. You are not revealing your true self, what you really feel, what you've really experienced to your audience. This does take courage. It takes courage, being brave. You have to be willing to take the risk, to be vulnerable. Now, I've been speaking to audiences for many years, but when I came back from Macquarie Island in 1977, I had a story. But it took me 20 years to reveal that story to a live audience, because I was worried about what they would think. Many years ago, back in 1968-69, I developed an ability to be able to do automatic writing. And this automatic writing enabled me, or perhaps enabled people in the spirit world, those who are no longer with us, to communicate through me through automatic writing. In other words, I could converse with dead people. Now, that's the sort of thing you do not tell the world. Certainly way back in the 1960s and 70s you didn't. Otherwise you could find yourself in a lunatic asylum, filled up with Valium for the rest of your life. So I kept this to myself. But in the mid-1970s, I did write my first book on the subject, called Ghost Guidance and Automatic Writing. It was rejected by every publisher that I attempted. Fair enough. But I continued with it, and as the years went by, so the profundity of the writings became greater, until eventually I was speaking or communicating with the highest part of my own self, which we all have, because you've got to remember the divine dichotomy. We're all separate, but we're all one. We're all one, linked through some part of our deep unconscious or subconscious mind. But to get back to my story of vulnerability, the story I told happened when my niece, was killed, and then later communicated with me after she'd died, asking me to tell the story that she'd survived to her mother. Now, I wrote that in a book, but it took me, as I said, 20 years to pluck up the courage to tell that story, because I would be revealing to my audience my beliefs that we are spiritual beings who are able to communicate with people who are no longer with us, who've passed on. And I wondered how other people would take that. Could I take the risk? And I remember when I stepped up and gave that presentation, just a short speech of 7 or 8 minutes, I was trembling all over, like I was giving my first presentation ever to an audience, even though I'd been speaking for maybe, at that time, 30 years. Vulnerability. It isn't that easy, but you've got to take the risk. If you want to grow, you've got to be courageous. You've got to be vulnerable. Are you willing to tell your true stories, the things that really happened to you, the things that have moved you and shaped your life? Are you really willing to tell those to an audience? When you are, you'll be well on your way to being the greatest presenter, the greatest speaker, and the greatest person you're going to be in this lifetime.